Well, howdy, friends and neighbors. This is your friend Hank Snow speaking, and on this record I will try to answer many of the questions that have been asked me during my career. To begin my story, I was born on the 9th of May in the year of 1914 in a small town on the Atlantic coast and in the province of Nova Scotia, Canada, called Brooklyn. Here I lived with my three sisters, my mother and dad, until I was 8 years old. At the age of 8, I was the victim of a broken home. My mother and dad were divorced at that time, sending two of my sisters to an orphanage and my oldest sister to work in a shoe factory. Lucky little old me was rescued by my grandparents, and I lived with them and got whatever schooling I could until I was 11 years old. The amount of my education, however, ended when I passed the 5th grade. Due to the love and respect I had for my dear mother, and on the contrary, the extreme loneliness and unhappiness that I experienced during my stay with my grandparents gave me the urge to steal away very often and go visit my mother, who at that time was doing daily housework for a wealthy family in Liverpool, 2 miles away. I could always expect a good thrashing when returning from my visit with mother, but the warm love and consolement I would receive from her was well worth it. You see, friends, my grandmother and mother just didn't see eye to eye. As she was my father's mother, and of course, as you may guess, held my mother responsible for the divorce. Well, just let's compromise a bit here and say it was a 50-50 deal. At the age of 12, I ran away from my grandparents, never to return again. I didn't know it then, but I was actually jumping from the frying pan into the fire. As Mother and I then moved to a little town 75 miles away known as Lunenburg, and shortly after we moved to Lunenburg, Mother remarried to a fellow whose occupation was a fisherman. My young boyhood from this time on was, literally speaking, hell on earth. I was treated by him, mildly speaking, like a dog. Yes, I took many beatings from him, friends, and still carry scars across my body that were left by his ham-like hands. My mother, however, had no other choice, as bad health would not permit her to continue her daily work, and she had to actually rescue me from an orphanage also. And then when I became aware of the fact that my presence was beginning to interfere with their marriage, I shipped aboard one of the large fishing schooners and started to sail the sea. However, after 4 years of this rugged life, drifting around on the cold and ice-covered Atlantic, and being shipwrecked once, nearly losing my life, when we experienced a 100-mile-an-hour hurricane which swept the decks of the ship and stripped the ship of its sails, and nearly piling up on an island in the Atlantic Ocean known as Cape Sable Island, or as the fishermen called it, the Ocean's Graveyard, as it was famously known over the years for countless shipwrecks and for taking the lives of thousands of men, women, and children. On this particular night, there were 6 of our neighboring fishing vessels sunk within a 100-mile area around us and claiming the lives of 122 men, most all of whom came from the little county known as Lunenburg County. I now had my fill of this life, especially after many close calls by steamers, nearly running us down during heavy fog on the Atlantic at night, and many narrow escapes nearly running into drifting icebergs, some of which were as huge as mountains. Therefore, after my 4 years at sea, I was through. However, it was during these 4 years that I made my first debut before an audience. I used to sing to the crew in my boyish-like way, and also would throw in the odd mouth organ tune and a little tap dance that I used to do as a child. And to show their appreciation for my amateurish-like talent, they would often give me pieces of candy which their wives would make for them to take on their different voyages to sea. Their encouragement went a long way with me, friends and neighbors. From the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, one of the well-known fishing grounds, to the lumber woods back of Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, from there to selling newspapers, peddling fish from door to door, a fuller brush salesman, an errand boy in a drugstore, a store clerk, a jewelry salesman, a stevedore unloading cargoes of salt, coal, etc., and many other jobs too numerous to mention. However, all through these hardships, I was trying to cultivate my voice and improve my singing. And then after hearing the first recording of the man who inspired me most to become a singer, the late and great Jimmie Rodgers, nothing could hold me. I was determined to become an internationally known singer like the famous Jimmy or Buzz. Then one day, after getting paid for 15 days' work, helping to unload a cargo of salt from Turk's Island, and for which I was paid $30 for the 2 weeks' work, I bought my first guitar. A cheap little old thing, but to me the greatest thing I had ever possessed. I would then listen to the late Jimmy's records and would try to sing his songs word for word just as he did. I was a long way from the beautiful voice and the guitar stylings of this great artist. But friends, I kept trying both to improve my voice and to play the guitar as Jimmy did. After appearing in several local shows trying to raise money for the needy and with the encouragement of the good down-to-earth country people, I picked up enough courage to write a radio station in Halifax, Canada, 75 miles away. I still have the letter that I received from the manager of this station, whose name was Major William Coates Borrett. The letter was dated March 14th, 1933, and reads as follows. Dear Mr. Snow, we have your letter, and I regret to tell you that we are not able to offer you anything at this station. All the artists who appear here are paid by the sponsors of the programs, and unless a sponsor were to ask for you, we could not do anything for you. If, however, your services are required, we have your name on file. Yours very truly, signed, William Coates Borrett, Managing Director. However, I did not let this discourage me, and here is what I did. I took part of the $30 I had earned in helping unload the shipload of salt and went to the nearest dime store, where I purchased several different items such as bobby pins, soap, razor blades, toothbrushes, etc. And these, along with my guitar under my arm, I started on a commercial hitchhiking trip to Halifax. I would go from house to house along the highway to Halifax and display my merchandise, for which I was selling for double the money. And if the housewife bought an item, it was understood that I would entertain them with a couple of songs. I doubled my money and arrived in Halifax knowing only one family in the big city who I could turn to for a couple of days' lodging. I had met them prior to this visit in Lunenburg, but I was just slightly acquainted with them. However, they were very kind to me, and after I had performed my amateurish-like talents to them, they, too, gave me a lot of encouragement. I then called the radio station and set up an appointment to have an audition, not mentioning, of course, that I was the same fellow who had written to them a few months earlier. When I walked into CHNS in Halifax that afternoon at 2:30, a very pleasant smile greeted me. He asked me if he could help me, if he had only known. It was a man who was to mean much to me in my hard fight to stardom. A man that I give much credit for the success I have achieved over the long, discouraging years. A man who was loved and respected by everyone, Mr. Cecil A. Landry. After I told Mr. Landry who I was and the nature of my visit, these are the words he used. Just a minute, Clarence, and I'll hear your stuff. Well, stuff was right, as due to lack of experience certainly added to the misery he was about to encounter during my audition. But much to my surprise, friends, he liked my work and asked me to prepare a show to go on the air that same night at 7 o'clock. He told me to be thinking up something to use as a theme song, but not knowing what a theme song was, And being very careful not to display my ignorance, I said I would. I then waited until I got back to my friends to find out what on earth was a theme song. However, I was before the microphone that night doing my first radio program, and I shall never forget it. I was so nervous I could hardly hold my guitar. Times got extremely rough from this on, as my radio show was strictly sustaining, and I had no other source of income. I struggled on, however, doing my weekly show over this station, and as I remember, I was advertised in the local paper as Clarence Snow and his guitar. This, however, was long before I adopted the name Hank. I continued to live with my friends in Halifax who opened their hearts to me. And then one day, through a friend of mine, I met my charming and wonderful wife, Minnie, and above all places, at a Halloween party. It was not long after this that we were married, and although I was not working, as it was just about impossible to find a job during this terrific depression, which had hit all across Canada, but my new bride had a steady job and was working as a chocolate dipper in a local chocolate factory and was making approximately $6 per week and had saved over the years around $150, which we used to finance our wedding as the one thing her parents insisted upon, and that was a good wedding. And I'm certainly glad they did, because I thought my new bride certainly deserved nothing but the best on what we hoped would be our one and only marriage, and which, thanks to the good Lord, it was. After our wedding and all the trimmings had been paid for, we had exactly 50 cents to our name. So we were forced to start out in life on the well-known credit plan. Therefore, we bought on credit $50 worth of furniture from a credit store and started housekeeping in 2 small rooms in the slums of the city of Halifax. I continued my radio work weekly, and my wife continued her job as a chocolate dipper until finally one day I was offered a job selling fuller brushes on a commission basis. This I took immediately, but unfortunately, they gave me a route in the slum district of the city where there was no money to be had from any household. And after 6 months, I had to quit because I was wearing out my one and only pair of shoes and no signs of income for the next pair. Speaking of wearing out my only pair of shoes, it is quite easy now to remember that I had worn holes through the bottom of these shoes and was forced to cut out small pieces of cardboard to use as inner soles. And, of course, these lasted until I made the first few steps on a wet or damp sidewalk, and then these had to be replaced, which was, as you can see, very often. People back in those days, friends, were under the impression that if you were a radio artist, why, my goodness, you were bound to be in the big money. But friends, let me let you in on a little secret. While doing my sustaining show over radio station CHNS in Halifax, I was on city relief and had to stand in a bread line once a week to pick up my bread, milk, and coal tickets. And for this handout, I had to work 1 day a week on the city streets. And the very first job they gave me was picking and shoveling ice from the streets and, as luck would run, put me to work right in front of the radio station. Well, I just pulled my old worn-out hat down over my eyes and with head down went right on digging as the announcers continued to walk in and out of the radio station. However, I don't believe they ever did recognize me. If they did, they were very nice about it because they never did say anything. Now, coming back to Mr. Landry again, it was he, friends, who taught me a great deal in the handling of lyrics. And while working at this station for several years, I gained a lot of very valuable experience through him. Plus the fact we had a lot of fun. You know, folks, he was the man who recorded my voice for the very first time. Yes, the very first time I had ever heard my voice played back to me. I still have that old record, so let me play just a wee bit of it. That is, if you will excuse the wornness of the old record, which was recorded on one of the first disc cutters back in the year of 1936. Now, here's a little bit of the song, Old Faithful.
Old Faithful, we rode the range together.
And there you are, friends, the first time I ever heard my voice played back to me. Sounds a little rough, doesn't it? Now let's turn this old record over and hear a bit of the hymn that was a favorite of both Mr. Landry and I, in which Mr. Landry sings the lead part, and I sing the high or harmony part. And here it is, folks, the Old Rugged Cross.
Ladies and gentlemen, and the old maestro are going to do a little number here at the cross. All right, Clarence?
Mr. Landry and I spent many an hour together, which were always filled with fun. I remember one day in particular, we were cutting a number of songs to be used on CHNS when I was away on personal appearance tours, and I was to do a song called The Wreck of the Old 97. Mr. Landry was to make train imitations with sandpaper between some verses, and then was to play the Jew's harp between other verses. I got confused and lost my place in the words, and it got us all adrift. He didn't know where he was supposed to come in with the train effect or the Jew's harp, and believe you me, it was a real frolic. Let me play this particular record just to give you an idea of how it turned out and how we got all adrift on the wreck of the old 97. Mr. Landry passed away in the early 1950s, friends, and we lost not only a great man, but he was also a great engineer and the life of all parties and loved by everyone everywhere who knew him. About this time, things seemed to get and to look a little brighter for me. CHNS got a sponsor who was interested in sponsoring my show, and then I obtained a program on the Canadian Farm Hour, which went coast to coast across Canada over the CBC network. Later on, another coast-to-coast show with a band from the city of Montreal, Canada, and other shows. By now, I had enough nerve, and with the encouragement given to me by Mr. Landry and others, to write to the RCA Victor Company in Montreal, several hundred miles away. I still have the first letter I received from RCA Victor and from Mr. A.H. Joseph, dated April the 18th, 1935, and reads as follows. Dear Sir, we have received yours of April the 9th, inquiring as to the possibility of your recording for RCA Victor Records. While at the moment we have a large amount of talent under contract to record the type of music in which you specialize, We are always interested, however, in trying out new artists. Though to do this, it is of course necessary to be present at our studio in this city, which is the only place in Canada where we record. If you happen to be in Montreal, we will certainly be pleased to make a test record, though we could hardly recommend that you come here solely on the possibility of your being engaged, as even if your test did prove satisfactory, we could not give you any guarantee that we would be able to use you in the near future. You do not state whether you write your own compositions, such as the late Jimmy Rogers and Wolf Carter, and unless you have original numbers, it is very unlikely that we would be interested, as our present catalog includes so many of the standard old-time tunes at the present time. Very truly yours, signed A.H. Joseph, Manager, Repertoire and Recording Department. However, this didn't stop little old Hanky, and I used the same approach with RCA Victor as I had used on station CHNS. So I took the old train, known as the Ocean Limited, and headed to Montreal and to Mr. Joseph, head of the recording department of RCA Victor. After a brief talk with him, and as he stated in his letter I read just a minute ago, he would not be interested unless I had my own and original material. I told him a little white lie and said I had several numbers I had written previously. Well, it's a good thing he didn't ask me for the titles or to sing them. However, I then went back to my little 2x4 room in the hotel and wrote my very first two songs entitled The Prison Cowboy and Lonesome Blue Yodel. Let me play just a verse or two of The Prison Cowboy, just to give you an idea of how my first Victor recording sounded and my first attempt in writing a song, okay?
Kind folks, you have heard the story and the song called 21 Years. All of how two lovers parted, of this sorrow, pain, and tears.
Well, I didn't get overly rich on the sale of this particular record, and I can remember my first royalty check was in the amount of $1.96. This, I thought, was the end of my recording career, but I was wrong. Mr. Joseph was very kind to me, and friends, he gave me the second chance at recording. It was my next recording a year later that helped me to get acquainted across the Dominion of Canada, and although the sales of this recording were very slim, it was still classed in those days as a smash hit and was called the Blue Velvet Band. Let's play just a little bit of it, okay?
Well, I'm be doggone. Look who's here. If it ain't my old friend Cactus Joe. Well, Joe, you're just in time to hear that beautiful old song all the cowboys out here been raving about so much. My Blue Velvet Band. So if you'll just pass me that whole cigar box over there by the bench, I'll try and sing it for you. Thanks.
If you listen to a story I'll tell you of a girl who once lived in this world, a girl who once was my sweetheart. She was known as the Blue Velvet Band.
From this on, fortunately, my records kept selling extremely well across Canada and had started selling in far-off Australia. But the going was still very rough. And it was during this time that our one and only child was born in a charity ward at the Salvation Army Hospital in Halifax, and who naturally I named after my idol, the late Jimmy Rogers. I would like to add a little humor in my story right here, friends, and tell you a couple of my favorite stories that happened way back in the days that were very rough. Before I started to learn to read music and teach by music, I was teaching a small child to play the guitar by ear, which brought me 50 cents per week and given the child the instructions. The child, however, lived across from the city of Halifax in a town known as Dartmouth, which was a 5-minute journey each week by a small ferry. The return fare on this boat was 1 dime. One day I was to go to Dartmouth to give instructions to the student, but found that I didn't have the dime for the fare on the ferry. So I fired myself deep in thought, and then I said to my wife, I've got an idea, if you'll carry it out for me. My wife, Min, was to proceed to a groceteria where her dad carried a charge account weekly at the food market. Since her dad was steadily employed as a fireman in a huge college, he paid his grocery bill weekly. Of course, they would have been only too glad to have given financial help to Min and myself, but we were just too proud to let them know our financial status. However, I told Min to proceed to the grocery store to get 2 small packs of Oxidol soap powder on her dad's weekly bill, which sold for 10 cents per pack, and this she did, although we both knew that we were doing wrong by her wonderful and loving dad. She returned wondering what the next move would be. I told her to go to a different grocery store and to tell the clerk that she had sent a small boy over for 2 packs of Surprise soap, which was selling for 5 cents a pack, and he had made a mistake and gave the boy 2 packs of Oxidol instead. The clerk apologized for the mistake that he had made and took back the 2 dime packages of Oxidol and gave her the 2 5-cent packs of Surprise soap and refunded her the 10 cents difference. So I had my money to go to Dartmouth to teach the child and came back with 50 cents to the good. Another story that I like to tell is when Jimmy, our son, was only 6 months old. We were renting 2 small rooms in the slums of Halifax, and the bed in which we slept cost us exactly $2 at a second-hand shop, and every time we moved to another location, which was very often due to not being able to pay the rent, we would have to drive 2 huge nails in the wall to tie the bed to so that it wouldn't collapse. Due to the age of the old tumble-down house in which we lived, the sound from other tenants penetrated the walls as if they were paper. So the neighbors thought they had overheard. My wife and I, with our 6-month-old son, was sleeping on the mattress on the floor. Since the bed would no longer hold the weight of 3 people, we had to set it aside and sleep on the floor. I used to make a joke of this each night when bedtime came by saying, well, let's go to the floor. Thus, the neighbors were suspicious of something. And, of course, I didn't want them to get wise to this, as I was now, remember, a radio artist, donating, of course, my services on a strictly sustaining program. The news in regards to the bed had gotten to the landlord, and through curiosity, he made an excuse that he wanted his son to paint around the linoleum in the bedroom, just so he could satisfy himself that we were really sleeping on the floor. However, by this time, I was making little money, and when I heard that they were coming to paint in the bedroom, I went to a furniture store in Halifax that was very famous for making sales for $1 down and the rest when they catch you, and bought a new $20 bed. But I told them to be sure not to deliver it until after 7 o'clock that night, which would be after dark due to the fact that this was in the wintertime. Keeping my fingers crossed, of course, that no one would be the wiser by seeing the bed delivered, I quickly had the bed carried to the bedroom. It was wrapped in a stiff brown paper and straw, which would make a loud noise when being unwrapped, and would let people know in the next room that something new was being unwrapped. Therefore, I would make a loud cough and at the same time tear the paper from the bed, thus covering up the noise of the paper with my cough. The landlord's son came in the next day to paint the floor, and since I had sent the old bed away with the delivery truck that had brought the new bed the night before, the landlord's face carried a rather peculiar if not disappointed, look of amazement to learn that the report he had heard he thought was false, and we were not sleeping on the floor. My wife's parents were wonderful people, friends, and had they known of our distress, they would have been more than glad to come to our financial rescue. But as you know, we, the humans of this old world, carry a certain amount of pride, and thus they never did know or learn of our hardships. I remember one day when our son Jimmy was only 6 months old and could scarcely crawl, when my mother-in-law paid us a visit. Jimmy was asleep in the adjoining bedroom on the mattress on the floor. This, of course, was just before we got the new bed. The door was partly open, and the first thing we knew, here came Jimmy crawling around the door. He had awoke and crawled from the mattress to the door. My mother-in-law gasped and said, "How in the world did that child ever get out of that bed?" We almost broke our little poverty secret at this particular point, but finally we talked our way out of it. I then, and by this time, had gained enough recognition and popularity within a 100-mile area to start making personal appearances. And I did extremely well on a small scale, of course. And the Canadian people opened their hearts to me and turned out in huge crowds everywhere we played, packing the little halls to capacity. And then after the year of 1945, after several years of personal appearances and radio work across Canada, I decided to fulfill my life's ambition and make a try in the United States of America. I went to many parts of the USA, friends, looking for a break, but continued to lose. Many times I went hungry in such big cities as Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Dallas, Texas, and many others. I rubbed shoulders with some of the biggest names in the entertainment world, such as Roy Rogers, the Sons of the Pioneers, Gabby Hayes, Rod Cameron, Gene Autry, and countless others. They were all very kind to me, and I am very proud to say that I now count them as my very special friends. But back then, their fortunes never did rub off on me. I then tried to convince the RCA Victor people in New York City that if they released a record of mine in the USA, it would sell due to my success across Canada as a recording artist. But they were not interested. I made several trips to the RCA Victor people in New York City and was always told the same thing. You will have to get known here in the United States before we could attempt such a risk. That's what I wanted the record release for, was to get known, and so that I could obtain some personal appearances. However, my good friend Mr. Joseph from the Montreal branch of RCA Victor finally convinced them, and they released my very first recording, which was Little Buddy and A Brand on My Heart, 2 songs that I had written and recorded in Canada many years before that. This gave me a foothold. The song Brand on My Heart held the #1 spot on a 50,000-watt station in Dallas, Texas for 16 straight weeks. When I heard of this success, I left Los Angeles and headed for Dallas. I arrived there with exactly $11 in my pocket and with a Hollywood loan company breathing down my neck, as I had gotten a loan of $3,000 from them on my car, my truck, and my trained horse in the spring of 1949. And not being able to make enough money in Dallas to be able to make a payment, they were just about ready to repossess everything that I had. I then pulled anchor and set sail across the border and back into Canada. I opened another personal appearance tour and traveled 6 months across the Dominion of Canada and into Newfoundland, now Canada's 10th province. I came back to the USA, paid all of my bills, and had a few $1,000s to good. I was soon to get my big break, and finally it came. I had been corresponding with Ernest Tubb for years, and he, like myself, was a great lover of the late Jimmy Rogers, so we had something in common. And then I got to meet him personally in Fort Worth, Texas. He told me at that time that he would do all in his power to get me placed on the world-famous Grand Ole Opry, and God bless him, he kept his word. And then one morning, the telephone rang in our little apartment in Dallas, and it was Ernest, telling me to proceed to Nashville as soon as I could to talk over the possibilities of joining the Opry. And through his untiring efforts, and after nearly a year, he had finally convinced station WSM and the manager of the show, and I finally joined the Grand Ole Opry on January the 7th, 1950. But the first 3 months for me on the Grand Ole Opry, trying to compete with well-known and established artists, was heartbreaking. And I have heard since that time that WSM was just about ready to leave me go when the good Lord stepped in and guided my pen as I wrote the song, that big eight-wheel rolling down the track means a true loving daddy ain't coming back 'cause I'm moving on. This song, thanks to the good Lord, swept the nation and held the #1 spot in all trade papers for 29 straight weeks and stayed on the charts for some 14 months, breaking all records and selling nearly 1 million copies. This was the big break that I had worked for many long and discouraging years, plus the fact that I was now considered a part of the world-famous Grand Ole Opry family and was working with the top stars in the business, such as the late Hank Williams, the late Cowboy Copas, my good friend and buddy Ernest Tubb, Red Foley, the late Rod Brasfield, Cousin Minnie Pearl, and others. Let me play a little of some of the shows that I have appeared on with these great artists. And first, the late Hank Williams introduces me on WSM.
He hadn't been down in this country very long. He comes from up across the border up in Canada. Since he's been here, he has really done a job. He's really going right straight to the top. Everybody's crazy about his singing and his songs. Let's rear back and welcome him again to Duckhead Saturday night. Hank Snow, the Singing Ranger. Pleasure to have you back with us again, Hank.
It's a pleasure to be here, Hank. It sure is.
Short Hank.
Short Hank, yeah.
Tall Hank.
Mutton Jeff.
What you gonna sing for us?
And now Red Foley introduces me on the network portion of the Grand Ole Opry.
Well, not very long ago, we had a young fella come visit us here on our Prince Albert Opry, and we told you about how he went right up to the top of the folk singing ladder in a short time after being in all kinds of trades and such things as in lumberjacking in Canada and all such as that. Well, so many of you wrote to us asking when he'd be back that we gone and got a hold of him to have him here for you folks tonight. Friends, let's welcome him, Hank Snow. Yay. Hank, what is your latest record release?
Red, that is one called The Only Rose.
The Only Rose, that's the one you're going to do, isn't it?
That's right.
Oh, Father Time has seen 1,000,000 hearts break with pain down the highway. And now I introduce the late Rod Brasfield on the network portion of the Grand Ole Opry. Rod Brasfield!
Well, thank you, man. Thank you. That was mighty fine. Howdy, Mr. Snow.
Howdy, Rodman.
I'm glad to see you,
Good to
Barnett.
see you.
I wished it would snow, Mr. Snow. Because, Barnett, it's hot tonight, ain't it? In fact, it's so hot I opened my refrigerator door a while ago, and you know something?
What?
Them ice cubes was fanning each other.
I was now in seventh heaven, and the good Lord had sure bestowed his blessings on me. Then, however, in August of 1951, I got a tremendous setback. I had a severe car wreck in Nashville, which put me in the hospital with a fractured skull. The news of this was carried in many, many newspapers internationally, and to emphasize the loyalty of the great public and the staunch followers of country music, I received approximately 22,000 get-well cards from every corner of the world. It was now 1953, and I felt that I must do something to show my thanks and appreciation for what the great master had done for me. So I donated my services to the armed forces in the Far East and left to entertain the GIs in Japan and Korea during the Korean conflict. This was a rough but a great experience. I shall never regret this trip, and I shall never forget the kind welcome by our American and Canadian soldiers and the way their worn and tired faces lit up to see and hear somebody from far away America, Canada, and their homes. 1953 was truly a year of great hardships and heartaches, and plus making the trip to Korea, I had the extreme misfortune of facing the most sad and shocking experience of my life. Friends, I lost my dear and beloved mother. She died of a stroke in October of that same year. It was also the year of 1953 that I decided to do something to try to express my appreciation to the one who inspired me, my idol, the late Jimmie Rodgers. So my friend Ernest Tubb and I had a life-size monument of the late Jimmie made in Italy, and then through days, weeks, and months of continuous trips to Meridian, Mississippi, the birthplace of the famous railroad singer, and plus pleading with the civic leaders of that city, we finally planned a National Country Music Day for May 26, 1953, where we proudly unveiled a monument before and in the presence of thousands of people from all parts of the United States, Canada, and as far away as England. Let me play just a few small portions of tapes that were made at the unveiling and which we used on coast-to-coast broadcasts across the United States and Canada, as our Memorial and Country Music Day in Meridian turned out to be an annual event, drawing tremendous crowds from many parts of the world each and every year. Now, friends, the next voice you hear will be that of Mr. J.B. Elliott, who at that time was Vice President of RCA Victor in New York and came down to Meridian, Mississippi for this special occasion.
Hank Snow, the great country singer, has been one of the strongest exponents of Jimmie Rodgers' music and a vital force in constantly winning new audiences for it. The tie was so strong that, as Hank has told you, he named his son after the master. The lad's name proved prophetic, for he is also an upcoming country artist. Joining with his father to record a memorial album, Hank Snow salutes Jimmie Rodgers. Hank was one of the prime movers behind the establishment of the Jimmie Rodgers Memorial, along with Ernest Tubb. But Jimmie Rodgers belonged to his friends in his hometown.
And now a small portion of a speech made by the Honorable Frank G. Clement, who was that time the governor of the state of Tennessee.
And when two men who I have great admiration and appreciation for, my friends Ernest Tubb and Hank Snow, came to the governor's office and said, Frank, we want you to go to Meridian, Mississippi for a day honoring Jimmie Rodgers, who gave us all our opportunity. And I told them that if Jimmie Rodgers gave them their opportunity, Jimmie Rodgers was a man to be remembered.
I would also like to mention the fact that the late Mrs. Jimmie Rodgers, one of the sweetest people I have ever met, and who was one of my closest friends, was crowned the First Lady of Country Music at our first Jimmie Rodgers Day, and believe me, she was well deserving of the title.
Jimmy Davis, distinguished guests, Jimmie Rodgers fans and friends. I am not a speech maker, and so I won't attempt to make a speech at this time. But I am profoundly grateful to all who have had anything to do with making this day possible. I am especially grateful to Mr. Ralph Peer of Southern Music for giving Jimmie his first opportunity to record. We are pleased that Mr. Peer is here today with his contribution to this occasion. My daughter Anita and I will always remember the thoughtfulness and assistance given us by Ernest Tubb and Hank Snow of radio, record, and Grand Ole Opry singers.
I would like to mention here a young fellow who has been a long time and a very close friend of my family and I, and who I am very proud to say I was instrumental in getting him his contract with RCA Victor. Plus, we had the pleasure of working together on many very successful personal appearance tours. I'm speaking, friends, of the rock and roll king, Elvis Presley. So you see, friends, the good Lord has been extremely kind to me and my family, and a great many things have come our way over the long years, and especially since I joined the Grand Ole Opry the 1st of 1950. Another thing, friends, of which I am extremely proud is that I had the honor some years ago of making several instrumental recordings for RCA Victor with my good friend and internationally famous Spanish guitar player, Chet Atkins. Not only do we of the music industry class Chet as the world's leading guitarist, but we of RCA Victor who record under his supervision think he is one of the most capable A&R chiefs we have ever worked with. Here now, friends, is a small bit of our work together on the guitars and the number Silver Bell. Before getting to the end of the story, friends, I would like to tell you about some of the very special things I have done in the way of entertaining. First, one of the radio shows that I used to like to do was the Prince Albert Show, which went coast to coast each week on WSM's Grand Ole Opry, and in which all of the different artists on the Grand Ole Opry took turns in emceeing. Here is the start of one of the shows to give you an idea of how they went.
From the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, Tennessee, the country music capital of the world, here's the 946th broadcast of your Grand Ole Opry, starring tonight the singing ranger, Hank Snow.
Well, come on, you two, and get to listen to me, let me tell you. Another show that I was proud to participate in was the Perry Como TV show, originating from New York City and which was televised across the United States. Another distinguished gentleman who mentioned my name on a coast-to-coast news broadcast from Hollywood, California some years ago was the well-known Jimmy Fiddler. In the year of 1961, I had the pleasure of entertaining the American and Canadian GIs on many of the bases across France, Germany, and Italy, and then returned again to entertain them in the year of 1962. Then in the year of 1964, I returned again to Japan, but this time under much different circumstances than in the year of 1953, as this time we played to all Japanese civilian people, and our crowds ranged anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 per night, and who were some of the most humble and most courteous people I believe that I have ever had the privilege of entertaining. We thoroughly enjoyed our 15-day visit to just about every major city on the beautiful island of Japan. Friends, I also had two very loyal and successful fan clubs, one in far-off Ceylon and one in the United States, in the state of Ohio. And now, friends, before I go any further, I would like to say a very special and heartfelt thanks to you all for making it possible that I have won over the years citations, scrolls, plaques, trophies, etc., for my work as an artist from the different radio stations, the trade papers, the record machine operators, etc. I was also, friends, awarded by Billboard magazine on behalf of all of our fine disc jockeys the award of being one of the 7 living all-time greats in country music. Not too long ago, friends, I was very highly honored again by receiving a colonel's commission on the governor's staff in the state of Tennessee, and also a colonel's commission on the governor's staff in the state of Kentucky. And at this narrating, I have just received an honorary captain's commission in the Tennessee Highway Patrol. Yes, friends, God has been good to me and my family, and with your kindness and help, through the long years, I have accomplished a great deal and much to be thankful for. Over the years, I have opened the Hank Snow Music Store in the heart of Nashville and the Hank Snow School of Music. I have 3 publishing firms, 2 operating out of the city of New York. One is known as the Hank Snow Music Publishing Company Incorporated, and the other is Hank's Music Incorporated. And then I, of course, have the Silver Star Music Publishing Company and Recording Company here in Nashville. In the year of 1956, the RCA Victor people honored me with a special dinner and made me a presentation to celebrate 20 years of exclusive recording for the label. And then again in the year of 1961, they honored me with a special dinner, at which time they made another presentation on 25 years of exclusive recording with them. And according to RCA Victor, this makes me the longest living artist to be under contract with the company for this length of time. I have just signed another long-term contract with the company, and if the good Lord lets me live, this contract will take me into the year of 1976. Now, remember I told you earlier in this record of the little white lie I had told Mr. A.H. Joseph back in the year of 1936 in the city of Montreal, Canada, where I'd done my first recording session for RCA Victor? Well, in the same city nearly 30 years later, on the 3rd day of June 1965, and before an audience of approximately 12,000 people, the same Mr. A.H. Joseph made me the following award, and of which I am extremely proud and most grateful.
Thank you, Gordon. Well, Hank, it is really difficult to realize that almost 30 years have gone by since I first made your recordings in Montreal. That's right. Since then, you've really achieved worldwide fame in the field of country music. And today, your recordings are in demand in all quarters of the globe. I'd like to say that we at RCA Victor are mighty proud to have had this happy and long association. And to mark the many millions of the records that have been sold of your recordings, we want to present you with a gold record.
Thank you very much.
And I'm quite confident.
Thanks again to you, the great and wonderful public, for not only making this possible, but for making possible the fact that my recordings and albums are now selling in just about every country throughout the world. I am now in my 17th year with the world-famous Grand Ole Opry, and at this time, I am looking forward with much pleasure to a continued and enjoyable association with them. Answering many of your questions, friends, as to my hobbies, well, I have several. I like to work with electronics and sound, and as a matter of fact, I have done some of my recordings for the RCA Victor people in my home here in Madison, Tennessee. I go in a lot for color photography and like to take 16-millimeter colored movies of our different tours throughout the world, as well as colored pictures using the regular still-type cameras. Swimming and boating is another special pleasure of mine, and when I have the time from my busy schedule as an artist, I like to go out on the lake and fish and swim, etc. I have always been a very firm lover of animals, and although I have lost many treasured pets over the years, I still have my trained horse, Shawnee, who is now, believe it or not, 32 years old, and of course has been retired for the past 17 years. I still have 2 very beautiful German Shepherd dogs. One is Pat and the other is Mike. In the year of 1958, our son Jimmy married little Carol Lee Cooper, the only daughter of Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper, also members of our world-famous Grand Ole Opry. And 4 years later, they presented us with a very beautiful little grandchild whose name is Vanessa Delane. It wasn't long after their marriage that Jimmy, along with his little wife, decided as their future in life to go out and work in behalf of the great Almighty, something of which we are extremely proud. Jimmy has been an ordained minister for several years, friends, and until just recently traveled across the United States and Canada in the evangelistic field, but now is pastoring his own church here in Madison, Tennessee. Friends, I would like to play just a small part of a tape which will give you an idea of Jimmy and Carolee's work together, both in preaching and in their recording in the religious field.
In chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, in verse 6, we read, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is." Did you notice that? That without faith it is impossible to please God. We must believe that he is. In the first book of the Bible, chapter 1, verse 1, phrase 1, the Bible says, "In the beginning was God." And this is what this verse of Scripture is trying to convey to you and I, that in this day and time, with all of its trials and perplexities and problems, that we must believe that God is. If we can do this, we can have eternal life. The Word of God teaches us. Faith. Faith came singing into my room, and other guests took flight. Fear and anxiety, grief and gloom sped out into the night. I wondered that such peace could be, but faith said gently, "Don't you see? They really cannot live with me." So in this day and time, it is imperative and important that we place our faith and trust in Jesus Christ.
Beyond understanding is the love of the Lord.
And that, friends and neighbors, brings to a close my life story in a very condensed form from May the 9th, 1914 to the date of this recording, January the 25th, 1966. And again, in closing, may I say a very special and heartfelt thanks for the great contribution that you have made to my family and I in making all these things possible. And friends, I promise to continue in the future in doing my very best for you all. And now, for this time, this is your faithful and grateful friend, Hank Snow, saying good luck, good health, and may the good Lord always be proud of you. And above all, don't ever forget to always keep moving on.
Rolling down the track means a true loving daddy ain't coming back, 'cause I'm